Sarah Mitchell never imagined her hands would hold anything other than medical supplies. She joined the Army as a combat medic because she wanted to save lives, not take them. Her father was a doctor, her mother a nurse, and healing was in her blood. When she signed up at 22, fresh out of medical training, she believed the briefings that told her medics were protected under international law. They wore red crosses on their helmets and armbands. They were supposed to be safe. The base in Kandahar province was her home for 8 months. She woke up every morning at 5, checked her medical bag 3 times, and reported to the clinic. Most days were routine. Soldiers came in with minor injuries, dehydration, infections, or asking for aspirin. Sarah treated them all with the same careful attention her parents had taught her. She remembered every patient's name and asked about their families back home. But Afghanistan was unpredictable. The region had been quiet for weeks, which made everyone nervous. Sergeant Davis, a veteran with 3 tours under his belt, told her that silence in a war zone was worse than gunfire. It meant something was brewing. Sarah didn't fully understand, until that Tuesday morning when Lieutenant Cooper gathered the platoon for an emergency. Briefing intelligence reported that a village 15 kilometers north needed immediate assistance. Taliban fighters had attacked a school and there were civilian casualties. Women and children were injured, and the local clinic had no supplies or trained staff. Sarah's heart sank when she heard about the children. She volunteered immediately, even though Cooper warned her the route was dangerous. They assembled a convoy of 3 vehicles. Sarah rode in the middle Humvee with Corporal Jenkins driving and Private Martinez manning the gun turret. Her medical bag sat heavy on her lap, packed with bandages, antibiotics, painkillers, and emergency surgical tools. She mentally reviewed triage procedures during the bumpy ride. Who to treat first, how to stop bleeding, how to keep people calm when they were terrified. The landscape rolled past in shades of brown and gray. Barren hills stretched endlessly under a harsh sun. Small villages appeared and disappeared like mirages. Children sometimes waved at the convoy, but today the roads were empty. Jenkins noticed it first. He tapped the steering wheel nervously and glanced at the rearview mirror more often than usual. Sarah felt it too. The absence of people meant they knew something was coming. Animals acted the same way before earthquakes, her grandmother used to say. They could sense danger in ways humans had forgotten. She tightened her grip on the medical bag and said a silent prayer, something she hadn't done since childhood. The road narrowed as they entered a valley between 2 rocky hills. Perfect ambush terrain, Martinez muttered from above. Sarah's mouth went dry. She had trained for this scenario but never experienced it. The manual said medics should take cover and wait for the fighting to stop. They were healers, not warriors. Their job was to patch people up after the shooting ended. Cooper's voice crackled through the radio, checking positions. Everything seemed fine for another 2 minutes. Then the world exploded. The first rocket-propelled grenade hit the lead vehicle, flipping it on its side like a toy. The explosion was so loud Sarah's ears rang instantly. She couldn't hear Jenkins screaming or Martinez returning fire. She only felt the Humvee swerve violently as Jenkins tried to avoid the burning wreckage ahead. Gunfire erupted from both hillsides. Bullets pinged off the armored vehicle like deadly rain. Martinez fired back in controlled bursts, but there were too many shooters. Sarah saw muzzle flashes everywhere, dozens of them, hidden among the rocks. This wasn't a small Taliban unit. This was a coordinated ambush with fighters positioned specifically to trap them in this killing zone. The rear vehicle tried to reverse but hit a roadside bomb. The explosion lifted it off the ground and dropped it sideways into a ditch. Sarah watched through the small window, helpless and horrified. She could see soldiers stumbling out of the wreckage, some on fire, others bleeding heavily. They needed her, but she was pinned down in a vehicle that had become a metal coffin. Jenkins made a decision. He accelerated toward a cluster of rocks that offered some cover. The Humvee bounced over rough terrain, nearly throwing Sarah from her seat. They crashed behind the rocks and Jenkins killed the engine. For a moment there was relative quiet, just the sound of their heavy breathing and distant gunfire. Cooper's voice came through the radio again, calmer than anyone had a right to be under fire. He was calling for air support and medical evacuation, but the nearest helicopters were 30 minutes away. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. Sarah looked at Jenkins and Martinez. Both were uninjured but terrified. Martinez had maybe 3 magazines left. Jenkins' hands shook on the steering wheel. Sarah's training kicked in. She grabbed her bag and prepared to exit the vehicle. Jenkins grabbed her arm and shook his head violently. "Too dangerous," he mouthed. but Sarah pointed to the burning vehicles and the soldiers who had managed to crawl behind cover. They were wounded and would die without treatment. That's why she was here. That's what she signed up for. She pushed the door open and rolled out, keeping low. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet as she sprinted toward the nearest injured soldier. It was Private Henderson, barely 19 years old, with a chest wound that was pumping blood. Sarah dropped beside him and immediately applied pressure. Henderson's eyes were wide with shock and pain. He kept trying to talk, but Sarah shushed him gently. She worked fast, packing the wound with gauze and wrapping it tight. Henderson would need surgery, but this would keep him alive until the helicopters arrived. If they arrived, Sarah pushed that thought away and focused on the next patient. Sergeant Wilson had shrapnel in his leg and couldn't walk. She gave him morphine and started removing the metal fragments. That's when she noticed the fighters advancing down the hillside. They weren't staying in their positions anymore. They were moving toward the convoy, weapons ready, confident the Americans were defeated. Sarah's blood ran cold. She had seen what Taliban fighters did to prisoners, especially female soldiers. Stories circulated around the base, whispered late at night, about captured troops found days later. Cooper saw them too. He was behind the overturned lead vehicle with 3 other soldiers, all injured, all low on ammunition. He shouted orders, trying to organize a defense, but everyone knew the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. The rescue helicopters wouldn't arrive before the fighters reached them. Sarah finished bandaging Wilson and looked around desperately. Martinez was still firing from the Humvee, but his shots were becoming less frequent. Jenkins had abandoned the driver's seat and was trying to help drag wounded soldiers to better cover. The Taliban fighters were getting closer, maybe 200 meters away now, moving confidently through the rocks. Henderson grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. His chest wound had stopped bleeding, but he was weak and pale. He pressed something into her palm. Sarah looked down and saw his sidearm, a standard-issue pistol he had managed to draw before losing consciousness. She stared at it like it was a snake. This wasn't supposed to happen. Medics didn't carry weapons. Medics didn't fight. The pistol felt wrong in Sarah's hand, heavy and foreign, like it belonged to someone else's life. She had fired weapons during basic training, of course. Everyone did. She could load, aim, and shoot if absolutely necessary. But the instructors always told medics that their weapons were a last resort, something to use only if they were directly attacked. She looked at Henderson, who was now unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. She had saved his life. That was her job. That was who she was. Cooper's voice cut through her thoughts. They were advancing fast, he shouted, his voice strained with pain and exhaustion. He had been hit in the shoulder but was still trying to coordinate their defense. Sarah could hear the desperation underneath his commands. He was a good officer, the kind who cared about his soldiers, and he knew they were about to be overrun. Sarah made a decision that would haunt her dreams for years. She checked the pistol's magazine, found it full, and tucked it into her belt. Then she grabbed her medical bag and ran toward Cooper's position. Bullets traced lines through the air around her, so close she could feel the air move. She didn't know how she made it without being hit. Pure luck, or maybe something watching over foolish medics who ran through gunfire. Cooper was worse than she thought. The shoulder wound was serious, and he had lost a lot of blood. 2 other soldiers with him were in similar condition. One had a head wound that Sarah immediately recognized as critical. She worked on him first, wrapping his skull carefully while Cooper continued shouting orders into the radio. His voice was getting weaker. The fighters were close now, maybe 100 meters away. Sarah could see their faces, young men with beards and determined expressions. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who knew they were winning. Martinez was out of ammunition. She heard him curse and throw his empty rifle aside. Jenkins was firing single shots from a pistol, trying to make every bullet count. Sarah finished with the head wound and moved to Cooper. She was packing his shoulder when she heard Martinez scream. She looked up and saw 3 fighters had broken away from the main group, circling around to attack from the side. They were going for the Humvee where Martinez and Jenkins were pinned down. If they reached it, both men would die. Something shifted inside Sarah at that moment. It wasn't a conscious decision or a brave choice. It was instinct. The same instinct that made her run toward injured soldiers instead of away from danger. Martinez and Jenkins were her patients now. They needed her protection just like Henderson and Wilson and Cooper. The oath she took said to do no harm, but it also said to preserve life. Sometimes those 2 things required impossible choices. She pulled out Henderson's pistol, aimed at the nearest fighter and fired 3 times. The recoil surprised her and the first 2 shots went wide, but the third one hit. The fighter stumbled and fell. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the weapon. She had just shot someone. She had just violated everything she believed about herself. But Martinez and Jenkins were still alive, and that had to count for something. The other 2 fighters turned toward her, surprised to receive fire from this direction. Sarah didn't give them time to aim. She fired again, not really aiming anymore, just pulling the trigger and praying. One fighter dove behind rocks. The other one raised his weapon toward her. Sarah saw it happening in slow motion, the barrel coming up, his finger on the trigger. She was going to die. Jenkins saved her life. He had circled around while the fighters were distracted and shot the man from behind. The fighter collapsed without firing a shot. Jenkins nodded at Sarah once, a quick acknowledgement of what she had done, then moved back to cover. Sarah's ears were ringing again, but this time from her own gunfire. Her hands smelled like cordite and blood, medic's blood and fighter's blood all mixed together. Cooper had passed out. His breathing was labored and his pulse was weak. Sarah holstered the pistol and went back to being a medic. She started an IV, pushed fluids, gave him medication for the pain even though he couldn't feel it. Her hands moved automatically through procedures she had practiced 1,000 times. This was familiar. This was safe. This was who she was supposed to be. But the fighters kept coming. The main group had reached the burning vehicles now, searching through the wreckage. Sarah watched them execute a wounded Taliban fighter who had apparently been caught in the crossfire. They shot him without hesitation, without mercy. That would be her fate if they captured her. That would be everyone's fate. Martinez appeared beside her, bleeding from a cut above his eye. He had found ammunition from one of the fallen soldiers and reloaded. His eyes were wild with adrenaline and fear. "We can't hold them," he said simply. There were too many, and help was still 20 minutes away. Maybe longer if the helicopters faced resistance at the base. Sarah looked at the wounded men around her. 5 soldiers who couldn't fight and would die if they were overrun. Henderson, Wilson, Cooper, and 2 others whose names she couldn't remember in the chaos. She had stabilized them, but they needed immediate evacuation. They needed time. Someone had to buy them that time. She picked up the pistol again. Martinez stared at her like she had grown a second head. "You're a medic," he said. Sarah nodded. "I'm also a soldier," she replied. It was the first time she had ever said those words and meant them. She had always thought of herself as a medical professional who happened to wear a uniform. But right now, in this valley with enemies closing in and her patients dying, she understood that being a soldier meant more than carrying a weapon. It meant doing whatever was necessary to protect the people depending on you. Jenkins joined them, along with 2 other soldiers who had survived the initial ambush. 5 people against at least 30 fighters. The math was impossible, but they didn't have a choice. They formed a defensive line behind the rocks using the overturned vehicles as cover. Sarah positioned herself where she could shoot and still reach the wounded if they needed her. Her medical bag sat at her feet ready because she was still a medic first. That would never change, even if she had to do terrible things to keep her patients alive. The fighters attacked in a wave, confident they could overwhelm the survivors. They fired as they ran, bullets tearing through metal and kicking up dirt. Sarah fired back, her hands steadier now, her aim improving with each shot. She wasn't trying to kill anymore. She was trying to make them hesitate, to slow them down, to buy precious seconds for the helicopters to arrive. Time moved strangely during the firefight. Seconds stretched into hours and minutes disappeared in the blink of an eye. Sarah couldn't tell if she had been shooting for 5 minutes or 50. Her world had narrowed to simple actions: aim, fire, reload, check the wounded, fire again. The pistol's grip was slick with sweat, and her arms ached from holding it steady. She had gone through Henderson's ammunition and moved to another magazine she found on Wilson's belt. The fighters weren't advancing as quickly now. They had expected an easy victory over wounded and demoralized soldiers, but the defenders were putting up fierce resistance. 3 fighters lay motionless on the rocks where Sarah and the others had hit them. The rest had taken cover and were firing from protected positions. It was a stalemate, but stalemates favored whoever had reinforcements coming. Sarah prayed the helicopters would arrive before the fighters called for their own backup. Martinez took a bullet through his leg and went down hard. Sarah was beside him in seconds, her medic instincts overriding everything else. She dragged him behind cover while Jenkins provided covering fire. The bullet had missed the bone but torn through muscle. Martinez was gritting his teeth, trying not to scream. Sarah worked quickly, packing the wound and wrapping it tight. "You're going home with a limp and a story," she told him, trying to keep her voice light. Martinez managed a weak smile. "Better than going home in a box," he replied. With Martinez wounded, they were down to 4 able fighters. Jenkins was nearly out of ammunition. The 2 other soldiers, Ramirez and Thompson, were both injured but still shooting. Sarah was the only one who could move freely between positions, treating wounds and redistributing ammunition. She had become a strange hybrid, part medic and part soldier, doing jobs she never trained for and never wanted. Cooper regained consciousness and immediately asked for a situation report. Sarah told him they were holding, but barely. The helicopters were 10 minutes out, according to the last radio update. Cooper nodded and tried to sit up, but Sarah pushed him back down. "You've lost too much blood," she said firmly. Cooper outranked her by several levels, but in medical matters, Sarah was in charge. He knew it and didn't argue, though his frustration was obvious. The sound of the helicopters arrived before Sarah could see them. That distinctive thump of rotor blades cutting through air, the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The fighters heard it too and intensified their attack, trying to overrun the position before air support arrived. Bullets filled the air like angry hornets. Sarah pressed herself flat against the rocks and prayed the helicopters would be fast enough. 2 Apache gunships appeared over the ridgeline, and the battle changed instantly. Their chain guns roared, tearing apart the hillside where the fighters were positioned. Rockets streaked from under the helicopter's stubby wings, impacting among the enemy with devastating effect. The fighters broke and ran, abandoning their weapons and scrambling for any cover they could find. Some made it, many didn't. A Black Hawk medical evacuation helicopter dropped into the valley behind the Apaches, its door gunners firing to suppress any remaining resistance. It touched down 50 meters from Sarah's position, and a rescue team jumped out. They had stretchers and medical equipment, real supplies instead of the field patches Sarah had been working with. She had never been so happy to see other medics in her life. The evacuation was organized chaos. Sarah helped load the most critical patients first. Cooper with his blood loss, the soldier with the head wound, Henderson with his chest injury. The helicopter crew worked with practiced efficiency, checking vitals and starting IVs as they secured the wounded. Sarah gave them quick reports on each patient, what injuries they had, what treatment she had provided, what they needed next. Martinez refused to be evacuated with the first group. He wanted to wait for the second helicopter and make sure everyone else got out first. Sarah knew better than to argue with him. She wrapped his leg more securely and gave him more morphine. The second Black Hawk was already incoming, following the same approach path as the first. That's when Sarah saw movement on the hillside. One fighter had stayed behind, hidden among the rocks, waiting for his chance. He had a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, the same kind that had started this nightmare. He was aiming at the first helicopter as it lifted off, overloaded with wounded soldiers. If that rocket hit, everyone on board would die. Sarah didn't think. She raised Henderson's pistol and fired at the fighter. The distance was too far for accurate pistol shooting, maybe 75 meters, but she had to try. Her first shot missed completely. The fighter didn't notice or didn't care. He was focused on his target, steadying the launcher on his shoulder. Sarah fired again and again, walking her shots toward him. The 4th bullet hit him in the side just as he pulled the trigger. The rocket launched but went wide, the fighter's aim thrown off by the impact. It streaked past the helicopter and exploded harmlessly against the far hillside. The fighter collapsed and the launcher fell from his hands. Sarah lowered her pistol, her hands shaking uncontrollably now. She had just saved a helicopter full of wounded soldiers. She had also just killed another human being. Deliberately this time, not in the confusion of close combat. Jenkins appeared beside her and gently took the pistol from her hands. "It's over," he said quietly. The second helicopter had landed, and the crew was loading the remaining wounded. Sarah let Jenkins guide her toward it, her legs moving automatically. She felt disconnected from her body, like she was watching someone else walk across the battlefield, someone else who had broken all her principles, someone else who had taken lives instead of saving them. The helicopter ride back to base passed in a blur. Sarah sat among the wounded, automatically checking bandages and monitoring vital signs. The other medics left her alone, sensing she needed space. They had seen the aftermath of the ambush. knew what had happened, understood that Sarah had done things medics weren't supposed to do. But they also knew that everyone on the helicopter was alive because of her actions. The base came into view, a sprawling compound of buildings and vehicles surrounded by walls and guard towers. Safety and civilization after the chaos of combat. The helicopter landed on the medical pad, and staff rushed out to receive the wounded. Sarah helped transfer her patients, giving detailed reports to the doctors and nurses who would take over their care. She knew every injury, every treatment, every medication she had administered. Her training hadn't failed her, even when everything else had. When the last patient was transferred, Sarah walked away from the landing pad. She didn't go to the debriefing. She didn't check in with her commanding officer. She walked to the small chapel on the edge of the base, a simple building with wooden benches and a cross on the wall. She hadn't been inside since she arrived in Afghanistan. She wasn't even particularly religious, but right now she needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, somewhere she could try to understand what she had become. The chapel was empty when Sarah entered. Afternoon light streamed through narrow windows, painting everything in shades of gold. She sat in the back row and stared at her hands. They were clean now. Someone must have wiped away the blood during the helicopter ride, though she couldn't remember when. But she could still see it, dark and sticky, mixing with dirt and gunpowder residue. Medic's hands weren't supposed to look like that. Medic's hands weren't supposed to do what hers had done. She sat there for 2 hours before Major Williams found her. He was the senior medical officer on base, a career Army doctor with silver hair and kind eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her in the quiet chapel. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I killed people," she said. Her voice sounded hollow in her own ears. Williams nodded slowly. "You saved people too," he replied. 12 soldiers are alive because of you." Sarah shook her head. "That's not the point," she said. "I'm a medic. I took an oath. First, do no harm." Williams sighed and leaned back against the hard wooden bench. He had been in the Army for 25 years and had seen plenty of idealistic young medics struggle with the reality of combat. "I'm going to tell you something they don't teach in medical school," he said. "Sometimes doing no harm means doing terrible things to protect the people who can't protect themselves." "But that's not what the rules say," Sarah protested. "The Geneva Convention protects medical personnel. We're not supposed to fight. We're not supposed to kill." Williams turned to face her directly. "The Geneva Convention assumes the enemy cares about rules," he said. "Those fighters weren't going to spare you because you wore a red cross. They were going to kill everyone, wounded or not, medic or not. You didn't break any rules, Sarah. You survived and helped others survive. That's what soldiers do." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the weight in her chest wouldn't lift. She kept seeing the fighters fall, kept wondering if they had families, if they had children who would grow up without fathers. She knew they would have killed her without hesitation, but that knowledge didn't make it easier. Taking a life was supposed to be hard. If it ever became easy, she would know she had lost something essential about herself. William stood to leave, but paused at the door. "There's a counselor you should talk to," he said. "Captain Rodriguez. She specializes in combat trauma." Sarah nodded but didn't commit to anything. William seemed to understand. "Take your time," he said, "but don't take too long. Keeping this inside will destroy you faster than any bullet." The next few days passed in a strange fog. Sarah returned to her regular duties at the base clinic, treating minor injuries and illnesses. But everyone knew what had happened. The story had spread through the base like wildfire. The medic who fought back. The medic who saved her platoon. Soldiers treated her differently now, with a respect that made her uncomfortable. They saw a hero. She saw someone who had betrayed everything she believed about herself. Henderson was the first wounded soldier to visit her at the clinic. He was still weak and would be evacuated to Germany for surgery, but he insisted on thanking her personally. "You saved my life twice," he said. "Once with medicine and once with my own pistol." Sarah didn't know what to say. Henderson was 19 and had his whole life ahead of him. If she hadn't picked up that weapon, he would be dead. Maybe that mattered more than her moral confusion. Martinez came next, limping on crutches but smiling. The doctors said he would make a full recovery and could stay in the Army if he wanted. "I'm going home," he told Sarah. "I'm going to see my kids and never leave them again." He hugged her carefully, mindful of his injuries. "Thank you for giving me that chance," he said. Sarah hugged him back and cried for the first time since the ambush. She had been holding everything in, trying to be strong, trying to be professional, but Martinez's gratitude broke through her defenses. Cooper was evacuated before she could speak with him, but he left a letter. Sarah read it alone in her quarters, her hands trembling. Cooper wrote that he had recommended her for a Bronze Star with V device for valor. He described her actions in detail, how she had treated the wounded under fire, how she had fought when fighting was necessary, how she had saved the helicopter by shooting the fighter with the RPG launcher. He ended the letter by saying she was the finest soldier he had ever served with, and he was honored to have her in his platoon. Sarah folded the letter carefully and put it in her locker. She didn't feel like a fine soldier. She felt like a fraud wearing two uniforms that didn't fit together. But maybe that was the point. Maybe being a soldier medic meant living with contradictions, holding both healer and fighter inside the same person, accepting that sometimes you couldn't separate the two roles. She finally made an appointment with Captain Rodriguez. The trauma counselor Williams had mentioned. Rodriguez was a small woman with intelligent eyes and a calm presence that immediately put Sarah at ease. They met in a private office away from the busy parts of the base. Rodriguez didn't push or probe. She just let Sarah talk, and once Sarah started, everything poured out. The fear, the guilt, the confusion about who she was supposed to be. Rodriguez listened to all of it before speaking. "What you're feeling is normal," she said. "Combat changes people, especially when they're forced to act against their core identity. You joined the Army to save lives, and you did. The fact that you also had to take lives to accomplish that mission doesn't erase the good you did. It just makes you human." Sarah wiped her eyes. "How do I live with it?" she asked. "One day at a time," Rodriguez replied. "You acknowledge what you did, you accept that you had no choice, and you use the experience to become better at protecting people." They met 3 more times over the next week. Rodriguez taught Sarah techniques for managing the memories, ways to separate necessary actions from moral judgments, methods for processing trauma without letting it consume her. It helped, though Sarah knew this was something she would carry forever. Some experiences changed you too deeply to ever completely heal. You just learned to function with the scars. The medal ceremony happened 2 weeks after the ambush. Sarah stood at attention while the base commander pinned the Bronze Star to her uniform. The entire medical company was there, along with the soldiers she had saved. Martinez stood in the front row on his crutches, beaming with pride. Henderson had returned from Germany just for the ceremony, still pale but smiling. Jenkins and the others saluted her when it was over. Sarah accepted the medal because refusing would have dishonored the people she fought beside. But she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done what was necessary in an impossible situation. Maybe that was the real definition of courage, not the absence of fear or doubt, but the ability to act despite them. She still didn't know if she had made the right choices that day. She suspected she would spend years questioning everything. But she knew one thing with certainty. She would do it all again if it meant keeping her patients alive. Sarah's remaining months in Afghanistan passed differently than her first 8. She couldn't return to the innocent medic she had been, the one who believed Red Crosses would keep her safe, and that healing was a simple matter of medical knowledge. The ambush had stripped away those comfortable illusions. Now when she went on missions, she carried a sidearm on her hip alongside her medical bag. She hated the weight of it, but she hated the idea of being helpless even more. The other medics noticed the change in her. Some respected it, understanding that she had seen realities they hoped to avoid. Others worried she was losing her way, becoming too focused on combat and not enough on healing. Sarah worried about that too. She checked herself constantly, making sure the fighter she had become didn't overshadow the healer she wanted to be. It was an exhausting balance to maintain. 3 months after the ambush, Sarah's company was assigned to provide medical support for a village outreach program. They would set up a temporary clinic and treat civilians who had no access to regular health care. Sarah volunteered immediately. This was the work she had dreamed about, the reason she joined the Army. Helping people who truly needed it, especially children who suffered from easily preventable diseases. The village was small, maybe 300 people, nestled in a valley that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of the ambush site. But intelligence reported the area was secure, and local elders had requested the medical mission. Sarah pushed her anxiety aside and focused on preparing supplies. She packed antibiotics, vaccines, bandages, and basic surgical equipment. She studied common diseases in the region and reviewed her Pashto medical phrases. The mission started well. Villagers lined up outside the temporary clinic, mothers holding sick children, elderly men with chronic pain, young women needing prenatal care. Sarah worked alongside 2 other medics and an army doctor, treating patient after patient. She held babies while administering vaccines, cleaned infected wounds, distributed medication, and explained treatment plans through an interpreter. This was pure medicine, uncomplicated by violence, exactly what she had signed up for. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, came in with her grandmother. The girl had a severe infection in her leg from an untreated cut. Sarah examined it carefully and knew it needed immediate attention, or the girl risked losing the leg. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, administered strong antibiotics, and showed the grandmother how to change the bandages. The girl cried through the painful treatment, but when it was done, she smiled at Sarah. That smile made everything worthwhile. By midday, they had treated over 50 patients. Sarah was tired but satisfied. This was healing without complications, without moral dilemmas, without questioning who she was. Then a teenage boy ran into the clinic shouting in Pashto. The interpreter's face went pale. Taliban fighters were approaching the village, he translated. A large group, heavily armed. They were angry about the American presence and threatening to punish the villagers for cooperating. The security team, 5 soldiers led by Sergeant Davis, immediately began preparing defenses. But Davis pulled Sarah aside and spoke bluntly. If the Taliban numbers were accurate, they were badly outnumbered. The nearest support was 40 minutes away. Davis recommended evacuating immediately, taking as many villagers as possible. Sarah looked at the line of patients still waiting, at the sick children who needed treatment, at the supplies they had brought. We can't just abandon them, she said. Davis understood her frustration, but he was responsible for keeping everyone alive. We don't have a choice, he said. If we stay, we all die, including the people you're trying to help. Sarah knew he was right, but it felt like a betrayal. They had promised these villagers medical care. Now they were running away at the first sign of danger. She thought about the girl with the infected leg, who would certainly lose it without continued treatment. She thought about all the children who would suffer from preventable diseases because the clinic closed. The evacuation was chaotic. Villagers who understood the danger fled with the Americans. Others refused to leave their homes and hoped the Taliban would spare them. Sarah helped load critical patients onto the vehicles, making impossible decisions about who to take and who to leave behind. The grandmother with the sick girl begged to come, but there wasn't room. Sarah gave her all the antibiotics she had and detailed instructions, knowing it probably wouldn't be enough. The girl held Sarah's hand for a moment, still smiling despite her pain and fear. Sarah wanted to cry but didn't have time. They drove away as the first Taliban fighters entered the village from the other side. Sarah looked back and saw smoke rising. The fighters were burning the clinic supplies, destroying the temporary structures, punishing the villagers for accepting American help. Everything they had worked for that day was being undone. Worse, the villagers who stayed behind would face retribution. Sarah felt sick thinking about what might happen to them. The ride back to base was silent. Everyone understood they had done all they could, but it didn't feel like enough. Sarah stared at her medical bag, now half empty after giving away so much of her supplies. She had saved maybe 15 people by evacuating them, but she had left dozens more behind. The math of war was cruel and unforgiving. You couldn't save everyone, no matter how hard you tried. Back at base, Sarah wrote a detailed report about the patients she had treated and the ones she had to abandon. She included everything she remembered about the girl with the infected leg, hoping someone might be able to follow up later. But she knew the reality. That village was now marked as hostile territory. No American forces would return there for medical missions. The girl would lose her leg, or more likely, die from the spreading infection. And there was nothing Sarah could do about it. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the ambush where she had picked up a weapon and fought. She thought about today, where she had run away instead of fighting. Both situations had forced her into impossible choices. Both had left her feeling inadequate and guilty. She was beginning to understand that combat medicine wasn't about making right choices. It was about making the least wrong choice in situations where everything was terrible. Captain Rodriguez called her in for a session the next day. Sarah described the failed village mission and her feelings of helplessness. Rodriguez listened carefully before responding. "You're grieving," she said. "Grieving for all the people you can't save, for all the good you want to do but can't accomplish. That grief means you still care. The day you stop feeling it is the day you should worry." Sarah nodded, understanding intellectually but still struggling emotionally. "How do you keep doing this?" she asked. "How do you keep trying to help people when you fail so often?" Rodriguez smiled sadly. "You focus on the ones you did save," she said. "That grandmother with the sick girl. She'll remember the American medic who helped her granddaughter and gave her medicine. Those 15 people you evacuated will live because of you. That has to be enough because it's all you can control." The conversation helped, but Sarah still felt hollowed out. She had joined the army with idealistic notions about helping people and making a difference. Reality was much harder and more complicated. Every success came with failures. Every life saved reminded her of lives she couldn't save. Being a medic in a war zone meant living with constant loss and finding ways to keep functioning despite it. Sarah's deployment ended on a cold morning in February. She had been in Afghanistan for 14 months. 4 months longer than originally planned due to extended orders. She packed her belongings methodically, the same way she had learned to pack her medical bag. Everything had its place. Everything had a purpose. But unlike her medical supplies, her memories wouldn't fit neatly into compartments and didn't come with clear instructions. The flight home took 36 hours with multiple stops. Sarah dozed fitfully between airports, never quite sleeping deeply enough to dream. Other soldiers on the plane were excited, talking about seeing families, eating real food, sleeping in real beds. Sarah felt disconnected from their joy. She was going home, but she didn't feel like the person who had left. That naive 22-year-old medic who believed in simple rules and clear morality had died in an Afghan valley. The person flying home was harder, sadder, and impossibly more complicated. Her parents met her at the airport with balloons and tears. They hugged her tightly, and Sarah let herself be held like she was a child again. Her mother looked older, worry lines etched deeper around her eyes. Her father's hair had more gray than she remembered. They had aged waiting for her, counting down days and praying she would come home safe. Sarah wanted to tell them she was fine, that she was the same daughter they had raised, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't fine. She wasn't the same. And pretending otherwise would be a lie. The medal ceremony at Fort Campbell happened 2 weeks after her return. It was bigger than the one in Afghanistan, with more officials and press coverage. The story of the medic who fought back had reached beyond the military, capturing public imagination. Sarah stood in her dress uniform, while a general pinned the Bronze Star on her chest and read the citation. It described her actions in clinical terms: engaged enemy forces, provided life-saving medical treatment, demonstrated extraordinary heroism. The words didn't capture the fear, the confusion, the moral weight of taking lives to save lives. After the ceremony, reporters wanted interviews. Sarah declined most of them, but her commanding officer strongly suggested she accept at least one. It would be good for the Army, he said. Good for recruiting, good for showing that women could serve in combat roles effectively. Sarah agreed reluctantly and sat through an awkward interview where she tried to explain what couldn't be explained to someone who had never been in combat. The reporter kept using words like hero and brave. Sarah kept thinking about the fighter she had killed from 75 meters away, wondering what his family was told about his death. Adjusting to civilian life proved harder than Sarah anticipated. Simple things became difficult. Grocery stores overwhelmed her with their abundance and choices. Traffic noise made her jump. Crowds made her anxious. She found herself constantly scanning for threats, planning escape routes, noting cover positions. Her therapist explained it was hypervigilance, a common response to combat trauma. Sarah knew the clinical term but couldn't make her body stop reacting. She took a job at a veterans hospital, working in the emergency department. It seemed like a natural transition, using her skills to help people without the complexities of combat. But the ER brought its own challenges. Every trauma patient reminded her of soldiers she had treated under fire. Every code blue brought back memories of trying to save someone who was dying too fast. She started having panic attacks during her shifts, sudden overwhelming waves of fear and helplessness that left her shaking in supply closets. Her supervisor noticed and recommended she take time off. Sarah refused at first, insisting she was fine, that she could handle it. But after the third panic attack in as many days, she admitted defeat and took medical leave. She felt like she was failing again, unable to do the one thing she was trained for. If she couldn't be a medic, who was she? Captain Rodriguez had recommended a therapist in town who specialized in combat veterans. Sarah made an appointment, figuring it couldn't hurt. Dr. Peterson was a former Navy corpsman who had served in Iraq. He understood military culture and combat trauma in ways civilian therapists couldn't. More importantly, he had been through his own struggles with reintegration and came out the other side. He gave Sarah hope that maybe she could too. They worked together twice a week for 6 months. Peterson helped Sarah process the ambush, the village evacuation, and all the smaller traumas that accumulated during deployment. He taught her that moral injury was different from PTSD, that questioning her actions didn't mean they were wrong. He helped her understand that being a healer and a fighter weren't contradictory identities, but complementary ones. Sometimes healing required protecting, sometimes protecting required violence. The goal wasn't to resolve that contradiction, but to accept it. Slowly, Sarah began to stabilize. The panic attacks became less frequent. She could go to grocery stores without anxiety. She reconnected with old friends who were patient with her silences and sudden mood changes. She started painting, something she hadn't done since high school, using colors and abstract shapes to express feelings she couldn't put into words. Her apartment filled with canvases covered in reds and blacks and occasional bright yellows breaking through darkness. A year after returning home, Sarah received a letter from Henderson. He had been discharged from the Army with full benefits and was attending college on the GI Bill. He was studying to become a teacher, inspired by the second chance Sarah had given him. He wanted her to know that he had gotten married and his wife was pregnant. They were naming the baby Sarah if it was a girl. Henderson wrote that he thought about that day in the valley often, about how close he had come to dying, about the courage it took for a medic to pick up a weapon and fight. He wanted to live a life that honored her sacrifice. Sarah cried reading the letter, but they were good tears this time. Henderson was alive and building a future. Martinez was home with his kids. Cooper had recovered and was training new platoons. The other soldiers had scattered to various assignments, but they were alive. Sarah had given them that gift, even if it cost her parts of herself. Maybe that was the real measure of her service, not the medals or the recognition, but the lives that continued because of her choices. She returned to work at the Veterans Hospital, starting slowly with part-time shifts. It was still hard, but now Sarah had tools to manage the difficulty. She knew her triggers and had strategies for coping. More importantly, she had accepted that she would never be the innocent medic she once was. That person was gone forever, replaced by someone more complicated and more capable, someone who understood that healing wasn't always gentle, that sometimes it required fighting for the patient's life in ways that went beyond medicine. Sarah kept Henderson's pistol in a locked box at home. The Army had let her keep it as a memento after the investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing. She hadn't fired it since Afghanistan and hoped she never would again. But its presence reminded her of who she had become. Not a hero, not a warrior, not just a healer. Something in between, something harder to define. Something forged in impossible choices and moral ambiguity. On difficult days, when the memories pressed too hard and the guilt threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah would visit the Veterans Hospital chapel. She would sit in the quiet and think about all the soldiers she had saved and the fighters she had killed. She would pray for both, hoping somehow there was forgiveness for doing terrible things for good reasons. She would remember the oath she took to preserve life and acknowledge that she had honored it the only way she knew how in that valley in Afghanistan. Sarah Mitchell never stopped being a medic, but she was also a soldier, a fighter, and a survivor. She lived with the contradictions because she had no choice, and slowly, painfully, she learned that living with contradictions was its own kind of courage. Not the courage that earned medals, but the courage to wake up each day and keep trying to help people, despite knowing how badly the world could break both them and you. That was the real story, the one that continued long after the ambush ended, the one that would define the rest of her life.